Pest issues in agriculture, even just in Ontario agriculture, is such a broad topic that it's essentially impossible to cover everything in a 15-minute lecture. So what I'm going to do first is give like that very high level 10,000 foot view of pests in agricultural systems, give an overview of common control strategies, and then present a number of case studies, again using this G by E by M approach we've been taking in class, just to give a couple of examples of different pest management issues relevant to Ontario agriculture. All right, so 10,000 foot view. Pest species worldwide, 67,000 known agricultural pests. The vast majority of those are pathogens, so that would be fungal, nematode, or virus, plant viruses. And the remainder, you can see insects and weeds. About 1/3, it's estimated, of global food and fiber production is lost annually to agricultural pests. Now, this seems like a lot, but remember, this is a global average. And as as someone who spent time in tropical systems and tropical agricultural systems, I mean, it's hot all the time. It's humid all the time. There's no electricity, or if there is, it's very expensive, so you can't really refrigerate things. Storing things is really hard. You might not have enough money to buy a nice grain silo. And so this probably includes post-harvest losses due to, insects and diseases infecting stored food, stored agricultural goods. So on average, every year, $26 billion is spent annually on pest control. But this is data from 1997. It's probably about twice that now. Now, in terms of economic losses, annual economic losses, it's split roughly in terms of its responsibility between insects, weeds, and pathogens. So each of those are responsible roughly for 1/3 of the total economic damage caused by agricultural pests. Worldwide, about half of pest control is attributed to natural enemies. And that would be things like natural insect predators in an agricultural system. You're not necessarily introducing biological control agents, but they're already there, whatever, living in the patch of grass or in the forest or whatnot. 40% of pest control is due to host plant resistance. And host plant resistance, that's controlled by the genotype. That's not a fungicide or herbicide or insecticide that the farmer's spraying. It's genes that are introduced present in that crop. And 10% of pest control is due to your herbicides, insecticides, and fungicides. Another global trend is that the percentage of total crop damage attributed to insect pests is increasing over time globally. That's due in part to more simplified rotations, which is intensifying pest damage actually through all vectors, but also primarily because horticultural crops like your apples or whatnot are have increasingly higher cosmetic standards to meet to not be considered damaged. So whereas 50 years ago you could sell an apple and it would look a certain way, it was damaged by a pest maybe, but it could still be sold. Now that apple would be rejected due to insect damage. And so there's somewhat of a drift in standards that's causing this increase in insect damage. Another trend worldwide in pesticide use is overall very low pesticide use efficiency. Now that's a term I made up. I'm not sure if other scientists use it, but basically about 1% of applied pesticides reach their target pests, 0.1%. And just to compare, about half of the fertilizer nitrogen applied to a corn crop is taken up by the crop, and so it's used by that crop, about half. For phosphorus in corn, that's about 20%. Again, phosphorus is a little bit less available, but still, a lot more than 0.1%. That said, this is probably going to change in the next 10 to 20 years. I imagine that 0.1 might shift a decimal place or two. As we have this law of technology where people, farmers and agricultural businesses are developing tools and technologies that are probably going to help target weeds, target pests much more precisely, much more accurately. Even though these technologies like machine vision or computer vision were not really designed initially to increase pesticide use efficiency. Another worldwide trend is that pest cycles are shifting, and they've been shifting over time. This is in part due to climate change and global warming, but it's not solely. Pest cycles just will shift naturally as they evolve. So this is an example of that kind of shift. So this is potato. Wait, what type of? This is potato late blight. Yes, potato late blight in Finland. It's just a graph that I got that just really shows this trend. I don't know much about potato late blight in Finland, but what you see here is on the x-axis 91 to 2002, and on the y-axis this is days after planting, so days after potato planting. And you can see at the start of the 90s you had days after planting, late blight would show up about 70 days after planting. And then starting in 2002 is about 40 days after planting. There's a significant decrease in the number of days between planting the potato crop in Finland and getting this late blight. So we have this shift in pest cycles and a need for farmers to adapt, changing G, E, and M. Next big takeaway for pests worldwide is that resistance is an evolutionary arms race. Many of the ways farmers control pests are selecting for resistance. They're putting pressure on that population to evolve resistance to that control method. That's true for new varieties with improved genetics to disease or insect resistance. So I have here, this is soybean cyst nematode, isn't getting better because current methods of genetic resistance, currently resistant varieties of soybean are becoming less and less effective. Then you have preventing fungicide resistance in corn and soybean. So that would be fungal diseases if you're repeatedly applying the same mode of action year after year. If you have a simple rotation, then you're going to be increasing selection for resistant fungal diseases resistant to those fungicides. And here we have, this is an ad from the 1990s actually, like a newspaper ad from Roundup Ready. And you can see the only weed control you need, right? Because I think that back in the day, that was really what the idea behind Roundup Ready was, and that's becoming less and less true. I mean, it's not inherent in Roundup; it's inherent in herbicides, and especially the use of a single mode of action or a single herbicide over time. The final big takeaway is that it's very hard to generalize about pest management. It's going to come down to the specific crop, the specific region, the specific production system, and of course the specific pest that you are facing. So, I mean, there are numerous guides to get you started online. Number one, though, is to consult local experts, people who have long experience dealing with pest issues with your crop or in your region. And that's probably the best way to get specific, practical, actionable advice, as opposed to this more higher level overview. That said, there's a pretty common way to deal with pests. You could call this Pest Management 101, if you will. The details will obviously depend, but this is basically how pest management happens. First, it's important to be armed with just an understanding and some background knowledge of the most common pests you're likely to encounter, right? Just so you're at least prepared, prior to the growing season, starting that crop, you have some semblance of what you're going to be facing. Next, step number 2 is identify the pest when you see it. Okay, obviously enough, but you got to make sure you've ID'd that species correctly. That can take some time, and you need to make sure you have the right species. Third, you got to monitor those populations. You have to monitor the pests, beneficial organisms. You got to monitor the level of pest damage, and as well as weather, which can promote pest damage. So certainly some diseases in Ontario are going to increase, or the risk of encountering diseases are going to be dependent on weather. And so you can use weather forecasting models to help you gauge risks in terms of diseases or even insects, because you can say life cycles are dependent on growing degree days, or can be predicted based on growing degree days similar to crops. Fourth, use economic thresholds where possible and past experience when making pest control decisions. So obviously, just because you see one insect in a field or one leaf that's damaged in a whole crop, doesn't mean that you need to control that pest, whatever is causing that damage. There has to be a certain economic threshold that's met so that the cost of controlling that pest, you'll at least make that back or more in terms of saving money or preserving more crop yield. And so finally, once that economic threshold has been met, as you've been monitoring populations and you've identified that pest, it's time to choose an appropriate control method. So again, this is fairly general, right? But this is basically the steps you take. So once a decision has been made to control the pest, you have a bunch of options available. These options basically fall into one of three categories: cultural or systems-based approaches to pest control, biological-based, so that would be native or introduced organisms, microorganisms, insects, etc., and then chemical control, which is probably what you would first think of when you hear pest management, maybe. So a couple of notions. First, pest control versus elimination. It's not always the goal of pest management to completely eliminate, every single splotch on the field or every single weed. It's often to control just to ensure that it's economically profitable to control, and so you're not getting major reductions in yield or whatever you're selling from that crop quality, etc. It's not really, try to wipe it off the face of the earth. That's usually not the goal of these pest management systems. That's probably obvious to most of you. Another one would be resistance, which we talked about. Another notion in terms of control strategies are regulations, which are going to, limit the options, you could say, of available to growers. So two quick examples of regulations specific to use of pesticides. These are primarily chemical pesticides, but there's also, I'll mention some others. So for chemical pesticides, neonicotinoid seed treatments, these are commonly used actually in a lot of different crops, horticultural crops, but there's seed treatments for corn and soybeans. And using these pesticides now is a little bit more complicated because of the regulations. You need official training in integrated pest management. You need a pest assessment report, etc. So it's a bit more complicated to use neonicotinoids now, and in some cases, it's just outright banned. If it's being applied on the soil surface, I believe that there's pretty heavy restrictions on that, not so much seed treatments. Next would be fungicide use in sugar beets. So there's a number of serious plant diseases with sugar beets. Fungicides are commonly used. They're sprayed multiple times a year because they're contact fungicides. So it has to be on the leaf to be preventing that disease. And so there's a number of fungicides where the industry is moving to reduce to no more than 5 applications per year. And the fear there is you're applying the same mode of action essentially time after time, and you're just selecting for resistance. So this is really a strategy or a regulation meant to reduce the evolution of resistance. There's also many acts which also limit, pest control. So in Northern Ontario, sandhill cranes are certainly a problem with field crops at certain times of the year. So I'll get photos from technicians of my plots if they've been damaged by sandhill cranes, and it's frustrating. Of course, they're governed by the Migratory Bird Convention Act, so it's difficult to control them. People are now putting up lasers on fields to try to scare them away or whatnot. But so there's many acts that are going to affect control. Okay, I won't go through all of them. There's many rules that prevent the importation of pests. So many foods you call sanitary, so phytosanitary controls, to limit the spread of pests. Countries will use these phytosanitary controls to get around free trade agreements, because one of the few ways you can kind of block free trade, or you can get around free trade laws or agreements between countries, is to impose phytosanitary controls. So, countries like for Canadian, it'll happen to Canadian produce or Canadian crops, where certain countries will say, oh, we either, you're using a fumigant or a fungicide that we don't approve of, so we're not going to allow that in, or we're scared of, importing pests if we buy, agricultural goods from this country or that country. So next would be laws For storage of pesticides, there's many rules related to that, storage and application, as well as buffer zones. So where fungicide is being applied in the field, if it's near a stream or if it's near a protected habitat, there's rules. Okay, the bottom line is there's rules that will limit options for pest control. Okay, so here's a list of some cultural control strategies for pest management. Number one is crop rotation and diversification. We've talked about this a lot in previous classes, so I won't belabor the point. I'm sure you've encountered this throughout your career, but yeah, more diverse rotations or rotating out of host crops more frequently, which is reducing pest populations, and having different crop species will allow for different chemical control strategies. And I would say even just other types of control strategies, because it's just giving you more quote unquote modes of action of different pest control strategies when you're rotating in and out of different crops. Next would be selecting the right genetics. So those would be ones with host plant resistance to the pests that are of most concern in your area. We won't belabor that point. Next would be nutrient management and tillage, which I'll talk about in a little bit. Use of trap crops, again, I'll talk about in a second, and changing crop phenology. Okay, so I'll just talk about that right now. So typically, pests have life cycles, and we kind of know when, for example, insects are going to emerge or when the disease is going to arrive, what weather is going to promote the disease. So if you time developmental events of the crop to occur outside of whenever the life cycle of that pest is occurring, then you can, you're essentially controlling the pest by escaping it, by having your crop flower or mature before damage can happen. And so a classic example of this in southern Ontario is winter canola. So canola is normally planted in the spring, and if it is, then its phenology is going to match up with the life cycle of a insect called swede midge. And the swede midge can absolutely devastate crops in southern Ontario. In fact, many would argue that because swede midge is the reason why there's very little canola grown in southern Ontario. It's a major pest. By growing winter canola, there's one can, you're planting it in the fall just like winter wheat. It's flowering much earlier in the season. It's reaching maturity much earlier than spring sown canola, and it actually escapes or largely escapes the swede midge pressure currently. So there's certainly an advantage to winter canola compared to spring sown canola managing swede midge damage. Okay, so in previous classes we talked about tillage, how tillage is important. It can be a very important strategy for weed control, especially in certain production systems. We talked about soil fertility and fertilizers in terms of cropping systems. These can also have impacts on weed species composition and numbers over time. And so let me just explain that. So this is data from an Ontario study done by a former professor emeritus now, Clarence Swanton. Long-term on a field, either no-till or conventional till, and then they looked at weed species number and composition towards the end of the trial. So first off, they found that weed number was not different between conventional and no-till, but the composition of the weeds did shift over time towards favoring different species. So large crabgrass was favored in no-till, redroot pigweed and lamb's quarter favored in the conventional tillage system. More generally, no-till can increase perennial weeds over time compared to conventional tillage. And the idea there is that with conventional tillage, you're disrupting those root systems, those rhizomes that perennial weeds tend to have, and therefore you're doing a bit better job controlling those perennial weeds. Now, another thing that this study looked at was the effect of nitrogen rates on weed density and the composition of those weeds. The actual nitrogen rate did not have any effect. So you're not really increasing weeds with high or low levels of nitrogen. At least that's the results from the study. What another Ontario study found, though, was that injecting fertilizer typically reduces weed growth and favors crop growth early in the season compared to broadcast applications. And I suppose the idea there is that weed seeds are typically germinating very close to the soil surface. Crop seeds are not, so their roots are a bit, when they start germinating, they have a bit of a head start on those weeds to access that injected fertilizer or banded fertilizer, and so they'll take better advantage of it. They can take slightly better. The fertilizer will be used by the crop as opposed to the weed, and so that'll reduce weed competition. The next kind of cultural control are traps. And these traps come in various forms, shapes, sizes. I'm just going to give a broader overview right now. So, traps are for rodents or sticky fly traps in animal barns. Flies can be a major problem with, say, beef or dairy production, so controlling flies in a barn. Bird netting in horticulture. So, certainly with high value horticulture crops, bird netting is used to protect the fruit from being eaten by birds, right? And so nets are used. Also, pheromone traps for insects. In Ontario, pheromone traps are typically used for pest monitoring as opposed to pest control. But certainly in the tropics, pheromone traps are used extensively to control the insects. Pheromones are essentially kind of attracting insects, and they get stuck to a sticky trap. So I know coconut plantations in the tropics will rely quite heavily on different pheromone traps. Coconut producers don't have the advantage of rotating crops, so if they have insect issues, they want to deal with that. Next would be trap crops. Now, I'm certainly no expert in this area, and I'm sure there's innovative, farmers that are experimenting with trap crops in a whole host of different production systems, but I would say this is probably more common in horticultural production in Ontario, and it's certainly more common in tropical countries, basically where farmers cannot really afford insecticides or pesticides. So the general idea is you have a main crop, that's the crop you care about, and you have a trap crop. You don't care about that crop, but that trap crop is much more attractive, much more delicious to the insects that normally attack your main crop. So if you plant that trap crop, the idea is you're distracting those insects from attacking the main crop. The challenge with a trap crop, is number one, if the insects eat that trap crop, well, they're going to still be hungry and they're going to look for somewhere else to eat. And so there's a challenge of making sure that once the insects are attracted to that trap crop, they must be prevented from moving back to that actual crop. So that's an overview of traps. So the next category of control that I'll talk about is biological control. And this, again, very broad topic. I'm certainly no expert in this area. This is just a higher level overview. So first, releasing insects, specific like insects reared as biological control agents in greenhouses is quite common. So I've seen them. If you haven't, they're shipped typically as eggs or like larvae maybe. And they're kind of in these like white pouches, like moist paper pouches almost to keep them moist. And I imagine there's some food, like some sugar in there. You just put them around the greenhouse, they'll eventually hatch and start eating the bugs you don't want to be there. So that's, releasing insect predators. In field crop production, I know organic farmers who will, say in hoop houses where they're growing vegetables, they'll plant flowering plants to attract insect predators, to get those beneficial insects to come and chill in their hoop houses. So that can be, Hoover Flies is one. I'm told by organic farmers will say I try to attract Hoover Flies, and you can tell they're Hoover Flies because they'll hover, and they're like looking for things to eat. But that can refer to a number of different species. Anyway, that's what organic farmers will do. Other people will just try to bring more habitat, like hedgerows or forested areas, closer to crop production. And so the idea is that these hedgerows or forest areas are habitats, small like little pieces of natural grassland or whatever, habitats for beneficial insects to come and take care of the pests. Now, the challenge with these beneficial insects is, of course, if you use a fungicide, well, perhaps bye-bye beneficial insects, right? So there's a challenge if you have to spray to control the pest, you might inadvertently harm the beneficial insects. The next category of biological controls are basically sprays that are sprays basically with bacteria or fungi. Normally you buy them, they're kind of dissolved in a packet and you mix them with water to activate them. But basically, these have been used for quite some time. BT sprays has certainly been used. It's organic approved. So we all know transgenic corn and soybeans. Transgenic corn can have the BT trait, and that BT trait expresses a protein produced by a bacteria. So what these sprays do are they just spray the bacteria, and the bacteria produces that protein, which will harm insects, certain kinds of insects. There's other bioinsecticides where it's not a bacteria, but it's a fungi. So it's same concept though. You're spraying this fungi to kill the insects. A number of different like labels. The one I'm familiar with is Bioceres or Ceres. Now another cool, very recent in 2021, CuteGuard was under registration for control of cucumber green mottle mosaic virus. So CuteGuard, what they explained it in the press release is that it is a plant vaccine. Okay, so you apply this preventatively, and it provides long-term resistance to cucumber green mottle mosaic. That's very intriguing. That sounds very cool. It's currently being registered, but I hope it's successful. I mean, it would be cool if more products like this come to market. Again, overall, I'm no expert in biological control. There are people in this province who know way more than me. So this is just a broad overview. The last but certainly not least category of pest management strategies fall under the umbrella of these chemical controls. And these are essentially chemicals that are purchased and then applied to the crop to control a specific pest or more broad category of pest. So there's a number of types of chemical controls. There's contact pesticides, which need to make physical contact, be absorbed by the pest directly to be effective. They need to be, so when that pesticide is applied, it has to hit and come in contact with the pest. We have residual pesticides, which provide from hours to weeks residual control. They don't need to make direct contact with that pest to be effective. We also have things like systemic pesticides, which to be effective first need to be taken up by the crop plant. It's taken up by the crop. It doesn't harm the crop, but this pesticide is distributed throughout the crop and can provide control of pests that will attack that crop. So there's a number of different categories. Pesticides are heavily regulated in terms of who can apply them. They have to be generally licensed, when and where they can be applied in certain instances, and when pesticides are stored. Okay, those are all very heavily regulated. Pesticides are expensive. There's certainly a reason why it's $1 billion market, though, because they also generally get the job done. Now, because they're quite expensive, farmers and agronomists will typically rely on economic thresholds to have as a decision tool to say, should I or should I not spray and use this herbicide, pesticide, insecticide, whatever. So typically the idea of economic thresholds is that once you're past that threshold, then pesticide use is advisable. There's an economic benefit to controlling the pest. And so obviously this is going to depend what this economic threshold is. It'll depend on the pest. So for insects, it might be, you count the number of insects per plant or per meter squared, or you count the number of weeds per plant or per meter squared. This is an example on the left of fungicide use in sugar beets and when that is and is not warranted. And so this is based on the master's research of Chris Deverak. On the top, you can see sugar beet. This is photos from Ontario where there's some damage. You can see on the outer leaves, and on the bottom you can see just much more severe damage in these sugar beets. And so typically fungal disease is typically assessed in terms of economic thresholds, in terms of the total leaf area damaged or how many leaves are damaged and show signs of infection. Let's finish off the lecture with a couple of examples of G by E by M interactions with pests. And the first one we'll start off with is how pests interact with newer, more modern varieties of cereals like corn, wheat, and oats. Okay, so it's been observed that more modern varieties compared to old have higher levels of water-soluble carbohydrates. These are basically carbs or sugars that are dissolved in the phloem. They're primarily found in the stem of that plant. So water-soluble carbohydrates have been going up over time. There's no clear relationship between the level of WSCs in a variety and yield. So it's not like there's a direct correlation between yield and water-soluble carbohydrates. And breeders are not testing their varieties for water-soluble carbohydrates. It's kind of hard to measure. They're not really selecting for that. So the question is, why over time are water-soluble carbohydrates going up when breeders aren't selecting for them, and it's not necessarily related to yield? Well, there's an idea recently, I wouldn't say a recent discovery, but a number of pieces have been put together that suggest that aphids have a harder time attacking plants that have higher water-soluble carbohydrates levels in their stem. And breeders do select for things like insect or pest damage, and aphids are also vectors for diseases, so the little incisions that aphids make are there, like it's an opening that diseases can get in and attack the plant. So the basic idea, without getting into the details, is imagine, those Wendy Frosties, how hard it is to slurp on those. And it's because it's so thick and viscous, that Frosty. And the idea is that the more soluble carbohydrates are in the phloem, the harder it is for these aphids to suck on. They just won't attack that plant. And so that's a new idea, right? So here's a cool kind of interaction that, by making these plants more frosty-like for the aphids, they're not being as attacked as much, and therefore they're not obtaining as much disease. So the next interaction between genotype and pest we'll explore is the effect of leaf angle on the competitive ability of that crop or crop variety against weeds. So here this is wheat, but this is true again for other kinds of crops. You have on the left a more erect leaf angle, more vertical leaf angle. On the right you have a more droopy leaf angle, very scientific term, droopy. So we have these two kinds of leaf angles. We know varieties will differ in what we call the canopy architecture, or the leaf angles of those crops. And which one do you think would be more competitive against weeds? Okay, well, if you guess the droopy leaf angle, you're correct, right? Those crops with the droopier leaf angles are going to shade weeds much more effectively and reduce their competitive ability. The flip side of that is those droopy leaf angle varieties will also shade their crop neighbors. So they ought to be planted probably at a lower density. Pest interactions with the environment. A classic one is the influence of soil texture on corn rootworm survival. So there's a number of different classes or types of corn rootworm. There's northern, western, and southern. The northern and western types are most common in Ontario. Look, I'm no expert here, so maybe it's like they're different species, I'm not sure. In any case, rootworms are not really a problem in coarser textured, sandier soils, as long as they're not irrigated. And the idea here is that as larvae are hatching in the soil, they're going to be moving around the soil and they're going to get scratched by coarse textured particles. And as they get scratched, they're going to desiccate or dry out. Okay, so this is a quote from a paper in the 1970s, so like 50 years ago. Survival of rootworm increases as percentage of clay content of the soil increases. So clay is not as abrasive, it's not going to scratch these little larvae. A greater tendency for desiccation is considered to be the mechanism involved in larval survival in relationship to soil textures. So the more you can scratch and desiccate, dry out those larvae, the more protection you're going to get from that soil type against rootworms. And so we can probably think in Ontario, as rootworms become more of a problem, people that have coarser or sandier fields might gain some more protection. So the next interaction between environment and pests, and this is a big one, is the interaction between weather and pest prevalence or pest pressure. So just like plants, where we can think of them growing in terms of thermal time, be that growing degree days, relative maturity, CHUs. Insect growth can also be directly related to the accumulation of heat units. And so just like you can predict growth stages of certain plants based on thermal time or heat accumulation, you can do the same with insects. And so you can use weather to forecast when important life stages of specific pests are going to happen, and that can assist with management. That said, the model, whatever weather model you're using to predict pest life cycles, that has to be calibrated and validated for specific areas. So a model that works in Oregon might not work in Ontario, and vice versa. Another classic example here is combining weather data, that would be temperature, relative humidity, the growth stage of the crop, to provide risk assessments for fungal disease outbreaks. So a classic example in Ontario is Dawncast. This is a commercially available forecasting system that farmers can purchase. There's also, Beetcast, which again is a weather-based model program. Here it's a different fungal disease in beets as opposed to Dawn in wheat. An example of pest interactions with management, a classic one, is the effect of crop seeding rate on, again, weed competitive ability, either weed biomass or total weed density, so the number of weeds per meter squared. This is a study in oats done across Canada. 3 seeding rates, 120, 240, 480. In Ontario, the typical seeding rate for oats is like around 300, let's say. So we have lower and a much higher seeding rate. And you can see that especially later in the season, say at heading and harvest, weed biomass was much lower in the higher seeding rate and the oats at the higher seeding rate. And again, this is probably due to just that shading effect. You have more oats, so they're shading those weeds more effectively. What's interesting here is you got to think, well, what's going on during that critical weed-free period? Because that's really when weeds are going to reduce oat yield. Now, I'm not sure when that critical weed-free period in oats is, but I imagine it's earlier in the season. And you can see here weed biomass at jointing. There was a significant, but maybe not biologically relevant decrease in weed biomass at that very high seeding rate. So I'm not sure how much of an effect this had on yields, but it's certainly higher seeding rates can reduce weed competitive ability. The next pest by management interaction we'll talk about is the effect of neonicotinoid seed treatments on economic and agronomic performance of corn and soybeans that are treated with neonics. So neonicotinoids are chemistries derived from tobacco plant that are systemic insecticides. So typically with a crop like corn and soybean, they are applied to the seed. Once that seedling germinates, the seed treatment is absorbed. Those chemicals are absorbed by the seedling, and it provides systemic protection against piercing insects. So that's wireworms, grubs, rootworms. Provides protection against a number of insects that can reduce plant stands and cause seedling injury. So neonics have been around for a while, but especially when they're sprayed, they've been shown to really harm other insect populations like honeybees. So off-target effects, you could say. And that's because, the honeybees are either going to eat the pollen of a treated plant like canola or sunflower. That's a problem. Or, they're exposed to dust in the air and they'll die because of that. Or some other mechanisms, right? So it's not good for honeybees. So the Ontario government in recent, well, I don't want to say in recent, it's been quite a while now, but the Canadian Ontario government have made it more difficult to use neonicotinoids or just outright ban them in some crops where they're sprayed. With seed treatments in a crop like corn or soybean, it's a little bit more difficult to do, but it can still be done. You just need some exemptions and training, etc. So there was a study done starting in 2014. It was funded by the Ontario Soil and Crop Improvement Association with a bunch of experts at University of Guelph and OMAFRA. So they looked at 160 site years, either corn or soybean, over 4 years, and they assessed neonicotinoid seed treatment performance in terms of the economics and agronomics across all these sites. So it was all on-farm experiments. They asked farmers to select parts of their field where they had seedling injury before. So areas where, these damages were prevalent. They compared they did not have an untreated control, but what they did was they compared a seed treatment that was only a fungicide versus seed treatment that was fungicide plus a neonicotinoid. And they want to say, well, what was the yield impacts, what was the agronomic impacts, and what was the economic benefits. Okay, so I'm glossing over quite a bit of details here, but these are the most important kind of findings. So first, positive economic returns were observed in about half of the corn sites and 23% of soybean sites. And by economic returns, I just means the increase in yield of the neonic versus just the fungicide was enough to compensate at minimum the cost of that seed treatment. So about half of corn sites, 23% of soybean sites. And then this is their quote: the results of this large study has 3 key points. First, early season insect pests are not uncommon, but rarely reach economic injury levels. So they were actually monitoring insect levels in the field and insect damage, and it was rarely economic to treat them because these were very low thresholds. So there wasn't a huge yield benefit to using an insecticide, a neonic. Next, early season injury, stand loss, and reduced vigor did not translate consistently into yield loss. So even when there was some injury, going back to this economic threshold, there was some injury, but it didn't reach an economic threshold when you got major reductions in yield. And finally, in their conclusion, there is no need or economic benefit for widespread use in Ontario corn production. And an overall positive yield response of 0.1 megatons or 100 kilos per hectare, which is really, really small, was observed with the neonic use. And so their conclusion is there's no need for economic benefits or economic benefits for neonic seed treatments. Well, I mean, this is a very good study, very well done. It might be a strategy to mitigate risk. So you might say, well, I'm not maximizing my profit here, but I don't want to be, that minority of soybean sites where I get a huge yield reduction. And so I'm just going to pay a little bit almost as an insurance, reduce my overall yield, say long term, by using a seed treatment. Accept those lower returns overall to avoid any serious risk. So there's that aspect. Finally, what I'll say is that there are now alternatives to neonicotinoid seed treatments. There's newer chemistries on the market that are much less toxic or potentially toxic to species like honeybees and things we like. The last interaction, this is a kind of a neat one, is pest-pest interactions in cropping systems. There's a number of these, but this is one interesting study that looks at the interaction between yellow foxtail, which is a common weed in Ontario. It's a grass. It's common also in North America. And corn rootworm, which is an insect pest we've been talking about in this class. So yellow foxtail is an alternative host for corn rootworm, but it is not as nutritious a feed as corn is. Okay, so entomologists found that in cornfields that had a yellow foxtail infestation, had quite a bit of yellow foxtail, the corn rootworms that were also present in that field did not cause as much damage to the corn. There wasn't as much lodging, there wasn't as much insect damage. And they figured out was because yellow foxtail is an alternative host to corn rootworm, those weeds distracted the corn rootworm. Instead of feeding on the more nutritious corn plant, they fed on the yellow foxtail, and that they were not as vigorous when they emerged. They weren't as powerful, and they couldn't cause as much damage because they ate that lower quality diet. So in this case, yellow foxtail was almost acting as a trap crop by distracting the yellow corn rootworm. That said, it's not a silver bullet. Yellow foxtail, just its presence during that critical weed-free period, did reduce yields. So independent of what's going on with the corn rootworm, just the presence of yellow foxtail reduces yield. So I'm not saying, look, no one's suggesting you should intercrop something like yellow foxtail with corn. No. But the bottom line is the researchers found or surmised that in planting Bt corn with rootworm resistance, weedy grasses may influence the survival and population dynamics of that target pest. So it's an interesting interaction.